Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Key Factors for Success in Collective Impact Evaluation Findings from the Field. I'm Jennifer Slansky-Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Institute, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining. Before we dive into our conversation, I'm just going to spend a few minutes orienting you to today's session. Today's conversation will run for 60 minutes. We'll spend roughly the first half of the time hearing from our speakers and reserve the second half of the time for Q&A from you. You can submit your questions through the Q&A box that is on the webinar app on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will be monitoring that throughout the session. In addition, we have uploaded a hard copy, or an e-copy, I should say, of the slides for the session that you're actually able to download from the webinar app in the handout section. So if you'd like to do that so you have it now or to follow along in another way, you can feel free to download the slides at any point during today's session. We are also recording the session, and so if you have colleagues you'd like to share it with or would like to go back to it at any time, you'll be able to access that recording, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording at the end of today's session. So let's go to the next slide. Again, this is a reminder, please use the Q&A box to ask questions. In addition, if you're interested in sharing some of your learnings on social media, we have included a few of our hashtags and things like that here on the screen. And if you have technical difficulties, you can use the Q&A box for that as well. All right, next slide. So I am just so delighted to have the opportunity to bring you today's session. I'm really personally very grateful for all of the trailblazing work that the folks on the line and their organizations have done for the field of collective impact. StriveTogether and their network members really blazing the trail over the last decade or more, doing collective impact work, and Equal Measure, who's been right by their side, as well as the side of many other collective impact initiatives and national networks, helping to elevate key evaluation lessons and findings for the field, and really contributing to a very important body of knowledge. And so we are really honored and grateful to have Danae, Justin, and Bridget with us today. Danae Davis is the Executive Director of Milwaukee Succeeds, a collective impact initiative of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, with a mission of ensuring success for every child in every school in Milwaukee, cradle to career. Danae also chairs the board of StriveTogether's national network, of which Milwaukee Succeeds is an active participant. Bridget Jancarz is Chief of Staff at StriveTogether, supporting the organization's president and CEO to work effectively with internal and external collaborators to fulfill commitments to the Cradle-to-Career Network, partners, investors, and the board of directors. And then finally, Justin Piff is Vice President of Learning and Impact at Equal Measure, where he directs evaluations of national systems change initiatives, including those focused on improving outcomes across the cradle-to-career continuum. Now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Bridget to kick us off.
Great. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We can go on to the next slide, and just good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. So really quick, here's what we hope you'll get out of the webinar today. So you're going to learn a little bit about the StriveTogether evaluation methodology. You'll hear how those insights have been used to guide StriveTogether's work and the work of network members like Milwaukee Succeeds, which Danae will talk about, some possible implications for the field of collective impact writ large, and then we want to be sure to answer any of the questions you have. I do want to note, just as we go to the next slide, we will probably go pretty quickly. This is a meaty topic that we could spend hours and hours on. Justin and I probably have done that before. So please ask questions because we're going to be moving fairly quickly through the content. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the StriveTogether Cradle-to-Career Network, but we are a network of actually now 67 communities working to impact the lives of about 13.7 million children and young people. About 9 million of those are kids of color. The network is focused on improving 7 cradle-to-career outcomes from kindergarten readiness all the way to employment. And we use something called our theory of action, which you'll become much more familiar with by the end of this hour, as an effort to build civic infrastructure in place to equitably change systems and improve outcomes while eliminating disparity gaps, particularly racial disparity gaps. So that's a little bit about who StriveTogether is. And if we go to the next slide, you'll learn a little bit about why we wanted to do an evaluation. And so StriveTogether was mentioned in sort of the seminal SSIR article about collective impact in 2011. And a lot of people came to us wondering about how to do collective impact, wanting to do what the Strive partnership started in Cincinnati in 2006. So we developed something called the theory of action to bring a level of quality and rigor to the field of collective impact as a way to think about how a place-based initiative could do this work with fidelity. And we wanted to test our hypothesis for how communities could work together to improve outcomes for kids and families. And so we really thought embarking on an evaluation would be able to tell us if civic infrastructure was actually being built and if that was improving outcomes. Here are a couple of things, because we always get these questions that we knew we wouldn't be able to do. We knew we wouldn't be able to attribute any exact correlation or causation to any particular outcome improvement related to something the Collective Impact Initiative did. In Collective Impact, there are so many inputs and conduits and partners. It's really challenging to be able to say this one thing caused that big lever shift. So we didn't intend to do that. We also knew we wouldn't be able to use a control group. So as you'll see who was actually a part of our evaluation, we did focus solely on cradle-to-career network members. And so if you can go on to the next slide, I'll share a quick definition of what civic infrastructure is. So when we say our theory of action to build civic infrastructure, we're talking about how a community holds itself collectively accountable and organizes to implement a cradle-to-career vision. So that's what this work is really about. I also want to note that you may hear Justin, Danae, and I use the term community, backbone, or partnership. I want you to know those are all interchangeable terms for us. It's the collective impact initiative that's in a place. So if you hear those things, they are not different things. We just haven't landed on one word. So on to the next slide. So to build civic infrastructure, StriveTogether with our network has posited this document called the Theory of Action. This is a really high-level overview of the structure. We can either send in an attachment or a link and a follow-up, the actual full document, which lives on our website. But the Theory of Action is grounded in 4 principles. These are the foundational elements that are core to the work regardless of where you are in the Theory of Action. You can expect to see 4 things. The Theory of Action is organized by pillars, which are components that we think are critical throughout the life cycle of a collective impact initiative to be able to do the work. And then our Theory of Action is organized by 6 gateways. And so if you were looking at it going from left to right, you'd see these progressive gateways moving to the right in more advanced stages. And within those gateways, there are specific benchmarks, which are specific pieces of work related to the different pillars. Just as a note, this Theory of Action was developed with our network. This wasn't something that StriveTogether just did in a boardroom or an ivory tower, but when we launched this in 2013, it was launched in partnership with the network and really developed by the network. So on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, StriveTogether said we want to evaluate the Theory of Action. We don't want to put something out in the field that doesn't actually get to better and more equitable outcomes for kids and families. And so after a pre-evaluation study, we were incredibly excited to partner with Equal Measure, as Jen mentioned, a vanguard in the field of evaluation around collective impact and the social sector. And they've been an amazing partner for 6 years that we've worked with them. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Justin to talk a little bit about the evaluation methodology.
Thank you, Bridget. Next slide, please. So in order to conduct this evaluation, the first thing and probably the most important thing we needed to do was measure civic infrastructure. So StriveTogether has laid out a framework for building civic infrastructure, but we needed to know the extent that those elements of civic infrastructure were actually showing up in communities. So we developed a list of indicators associated with the theory of action and to really reflect how civic infrastructure plays out in communities. So what data use looks like, what data sharing looks like, how communication takes place, what it means to engage a community, for example, in collective impact work. And operationalizing that framework led us to an 83-question survey that we shared with partners across a set of communities. We asked partners to tell us the extent that they were experiencing those ways of working associated with the theory of action in their communities. So I'm going to share a number of values of percentages on the next few slides. And one important note is that those percentages reflect the percentage of folks in communities who rated particular items or sets of items a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale, essentially meaning that, yeah, those items, those actions or those behaviors are pretty much happening in our community. So when you see those percentages, they reflect the number of folks who've said, yeah, we're seeing that happen in our community. That's pretty much what we do and how we're functioning. Next slide, please. So in addition to measuring civic infrastructure through this 83-item survey, we also conducted an outcomes evaluation, and we had a subset of communities, 10 communities, submit outcomes data to us, and that included what we often refer to as leading or contributing indicators and also core outcomes, so both the short and long-term outcomes associated with collective impact work. And then we also conducted 25 interviews with folks from across the network communities to tell us a little bit more about the experience of building civic infrastructure in their communities, including strengths of the StriveTogether framework, challenges they're experiencing, as well as how they're operationalizing these various elements of the framework. And with those interviews, we had a particular focus on better understanding how equity plays out, how community engagement plays out, and just generally how folks conceptualize and think about actualizing systems change. Next slide, please. We had about 20 communities participate in the evaluation, and we had 14 communities participate for 3 years. So we actually launched formally the evaluation in 2015 and then resurveyed folks in 2016 and 2017. So for 14 communities, we have 3 years worth of data, and then a subset of those communities, we have 3 years worth of data on their outcomes as well. In total, we conducted over 4,000 surveys from partners across communities across the United States. And by design, we selected a diverse set of communities. They're all over the country, and they were at varying developmental stages and varying levels of maturity, in part so that we could watch growth over time. We wanted to be able to track development of civic infrastructure, so felt it was important not to start with just the most mature communities from the get-go. Next slide, please. I think we're missing a slide. There we go. Okay, so the first thing we did, so Bridget mentioned that StriveTogether conceptualizes collective impact as having 3 stages, or excuse me, 4 stages or 4 gateways: exploring, emerging, sustaining, and systems change. So we looked at the extent to that behaviors associated with each of those 4 gateways was showing up in communities and quantified those behaviors. So again, things like data use, shared vision, community engagement, and the like. And you can see those 3 years worth of data across these 14 communities on the chart in front of you. And there are 2 important patterns I want to point out. You can go to the next slide. The first is that you see the highest evidence of behaviors and ways of working associated with the exploring gateway, and the least evidence, if you will, of actions and behaviors associated with systems change. Now, StriveTogether posits that the work of collective impact is cumulative and it unfolds in stages. So essentially what you have here is evidence that that is, in fact, what's been happening across this set of communities. Communities are, in essence, crawling before they're running because they're seeing the most evidence with those earlier stage gateways and the least evidence with those associated with the latter gateways, or in this case, systems change. So for us, this chart really validates a key component of the theory of action, which is that there's something to building civic infrastructure, and there are a set of sequential steps necessary in order to build that out from start to finish. You can go to the next slide. The second pattern you see here is that civic infrastructure, according to each of these 4 gateways, actually increased pretty much each year. It stayed the same in years 2 and 3 of the exploring gateway, but otherwise we see steady growth. And of course, it's nice if you're StriveTogether to see growth across your network in civic infrastructure. But what's really interesting is that pattern of the highest elements of civic infrastructure being those earlier stage gateways and the lower elements of civic infrastructure being system change, maintaining over the course of the evaluation. So even though we saw growth year over year over year, we saw a consistent pattern, and that's sort of what we had expected, or at least thought we should see if the theory of action was, if work was unfolding according to the way it was laid out in the theory of action. Next slide, please. So what the theory of action does is lay out these 4 gateways, and there are 4 pillars, as Bridget mentioned, within each of these gateways. But StriveTogether does not dictate how the work within each gateway is tackled up. So it doesn't necessarily say start with shared vision or start with evidence-based decision making. There's no accounting for what this might look like across gateways, and that's by design. But we wanted to understand the extent that there might be patterns in how communities implement the activities associated with these different gateways. So what you have in front of you are 3 years worth of data where we've unpacked the pillars within each gateway, and again, quantified the behaviors associated with each of those pillars. And what you see here is a really remarkable, very remarkable pattern actually, and remarkable consistency with respect to how different aspects of civic infrastructure show up within each gateway. So you can see, for example, in the exploring gateway, that collaborative action is consistently very high, and it's always the highest. And then you can see, looking across this chart, that there are other areas that are consistently the lowest. And what this does is tell us that communities are implementing the theory of action with consistency, but also with a nuanced consistency, where we can understand where communities are struggling within particular gateways and where they're able to accelerate their work or take it on more quickly. So this particular chart, often referred to as our favorite chart internally, tells us a lot about how the elements of the theory of action unfold within and across communities and over time. Next slide, please. So this is all good to know, but for us, what really matters is whether civic infrastructure is actually having an effect on children and youth in communities. And we found that it does. We found that there's reason to believe building civic infrastructure can lead to improvements in contributing indicators. And before I share the slide with you that gives us reason to believe that's the case, I'll let Bridget tee it up a little bit and talk a bit about the role of contributing indicators in this work.
Sure, if you could go on to the next slide. Just really quickly, we talk about this work around core outcomes, kindergarten readiness, post-secondary enrollment, high school graduation. But what we also knew is that those are big lever outcomes, and we didn't expect to see material changes in those over the course of the evaluation. We knew that that would be way too big a bet, especially because communities were at different stages of their development. So the thing we wanted to do, and a piece of work we do with our network members, is build in contributing indicators. So what are some of those on-track measures that tell you if you're on track to be able to improve outcomes like kindergarten readiness or post-secondary enrollment? So in the outcomes evaluation, we looked at contributing indicator improvement. So different communities had different contributing indicators. Those are identified by each community based on their local context, the work that they were doing. And so we just wanted to make this distinction because it would be super sexy to be able to say that it's connected to great outcomes improvement. And we certainly saw some outcomes start trending in the right direction, but where we really saw the rubber meet the road was around strategies to address these contributing indicators and improvement therein. I think we can go on to the next slide.
So in order to understand the relationship between civic infrastructure and movement on contributing indicators, first we needed to measure both, and I walked through how we did that with civic infrastructure. And then we wanted to look at the extent that there was a relationship between improvements on civic infrastructure and movement on those indicators. And you can go to the next slide. I'll show you what we came up with, and this slide can be a little daunting at first, so I will walk you through it. Moving from left to right across the x-axis. Let me back up a little bit. So each of these circles here represents a community, and it actually represents a community during a 2-year time period. So the blue dots represent change from 2015 to 2016, and the orange represent change from 2016 to 2017. So the 10 communities are reflected on here twice. One is only on here once, so there are 19 dots on here. And the farther to the right that a circle appears, the greater its growth in civic infrastructure was. And the closer to the top of the chart that a dot lies, the greater the number of contributing indicators it was focused on improved. So for example, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, there are 2 dots there because 2 communities actually increased all 16 elements of the theory of action. So increased civic infrastructure 100%, if you will, and increased year over year 100% of the contributing indicators they were focused on as well. So we wanted to see if there was a linear relationship here. And we've labeled the 4 quadrants to make this a little bit easier to understand. So the communities in the upper left-hand quadrant, quadrant 1, saw high indicator improvement but low growth in civic infrastructure. Quadrant 2 saw high improvement in indicators as well as high growth in civic infrastructure, and you can sort of go around to quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So you'll notice that most of these circles sit within quadrants 2 and quadrants 4. So we generally saw an association between improvements in indicators and growth in civic infrastructure, and that's quadrant 2, or we saw in quadrant 4, not much growth in civic infrastructure, but in a corresponding way, we didn't really see that much growth associated with the indicators they were trying to move either. So again, if there's a relationship there, this is what we would expect to see. The circles in quadrant 3 don't really concern us much. We saw pretty good growth in those communities on civic infrastructure, but just not as strong movement on their indicators as maybe we would have liked in relative to some of the others. If you can go to the next slide. What puzzled us a bit, though, were these 3 dots in the upper left-hand quadrant in quadrant 1, where we saw pretty high indicator improvement, but relatively low growth in civic infrastructure. And we were really puzzled by this. So we were racking our brains thinking, like, the rest of this makes sense, but why are there 3 circles here that saw pretty good movement on their indicators despite very little growth in civic infrastructure? And what we realized is that these 3 dots actually reflect 2 communities, and they reflect the 2 communities that began the evaluation period with the highest overall ratings of civic infrastructure. And so when we realized that, and after interviewing folks as well, what we realized is that more than likely, these communities had a really hard time improving on civic infrastructure year over year because they were already at the top. They were already the highest functioning, if you will, communities with respect to civic infrastructure. And so we posit that they've actually been able to maintain momentum and movement in their work without, quote, growing their civic infrastructure because they were already there. They were already basically the A-plus students who couldn't really get any better. There was no really where else for them to move, but they continued to move the needle on their contributing indicators during those same time periods. So if you can click to the next slide. If we pull those two high-performing communities out of this chart, it becomes really apparent to us that there seems to be an association between improvements on civic infrastructure and the ability to move the needle on contributing indicators. So we're really excited by this slide. As Bridget mentioned earlier, it does not necessarily or isn't meant to imply causality, but if there is a causal relationship between civic infrastructure and movement on indicators, this is exactly the type of data and the type of chart we would expect to see. So this gives us a lot of hope that there is a relationship between these two entities and that high civic infrastructure in and of itself is enough to move the needle on contributing indicators. You can go to the next slide.
Great. So thank you, Justin, for sharing all of the ins and outs of the evaluation. The important thing to note is that the evaluation wasn't done and we didn't all just smile and say, that's great. We actually wanted to think about, okay, how does this influence or impact our work? So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a few different ways that this has actually impacted what StriveTogether is doing. We made revisions to the theory of action actually in 2015, 2017, and 2018 using favorite chart to think about the way that communities develop different buckets of work. We work to make things a little bit more specific, build out some work earlier where we noticed communities were struggling. I noticed that data is incredibly strong for our network, and so wanted to think about how we continually make that more robust and how we really embrace that as the StriveTogether superpower. We also saw that we needed to shift from community engagement to community authority, and that actually came out in some of the qualitative work. We realized that there's an importance of shared vision at all stages, and we'll talk more about that we need to advance equity in a way that is both central and explicit. And we identified that you can't ever work at the systems level too early. And so I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to go through quicker than I would like. If you go ahead and go on to the next slide. I wanted to make sure to mention data because, as I said, that's StriveTogether's superpower. And Justin and I have presented a few different times with the Collective Impact Forum and have gotten a sense for how data plays out in other collective impact initiatives. And what we see is the StriveTogether sites have a higher propensity for data use than others, while other types of communities or collective impact initiatives are higher in other areas. And so on this slide, you can see some of the ways that data are critical to not just creating a shared vision, but ways to prioritize the work. And so we've really been trying to keep this a focus, and we've also been more cognizant about how we're using qualitative and lived experience data in addition to quantitative data. And if you go on to the next slide, I also mentioned that we saw community engagement scores were relatively low throughout the evaluation. They did improve some, but what we heard through the qualitative data was that communities can't just be engaged. They have to take the power that they deserve and need to be able to improve outcomes. And so this starts with thinking about how community is engaged and setting goals and contributing to the shared vision and moving on from there. On the next slide, I have just an example of one way that the community was engaged in policy work in two different communities. In Dayton and Cincinnati, Ohio, in 2016, both were able to pass preschool promises that provide universal pre-K to students in need. And this was really about building community will. In Cincinnati, the ballot measure passed at something like 64%. No ballot measure has ever passed with such a high percentage of support related to taxes and education. And this was really rooted in the community owning the outcome in the process. And as you can see on the slide, Michael Carter basically says that the same thing happened in Dayton. And so essentially all of this told us we need to go all in on community authority to be able to get to change. And next slide, please. And one of the things that folks are probably kind of shaking their heads on, like, duh, shared vision is obviously a critical component, and it certainly is a critical component at the beginning of a collective impact initiative. But what we saw is that you don't just set a shared vision once and then say it's done. It requires redesign, negotiation, realignment at different points. And Danae is actually going to talk about how they've been doing that in Milwaukee.
So in Milwaukee, thank you, Bridget. We are a collective impact partner of 8 years old, if you will. And so it's the right time for our partnership to really step back and sort of realign our shared vision. Our approach to that was strategic planning with a different model. So we remain committed to the cradle-to-career continuum, but our approach in terms of what are we seeking to achieve in results, higher level of outcomes for our children and youth in Milwaukee, really is looking at what are the core indicators that we need to focus on, one or two, prioritize, as one of our leaders said, crush it, and then based on what we've learned about that model of a deeper dive, if you will, around not only the core indicators, but those indicators that contribute to the success, what can we then use to then take on other core and contributing indicators? In our case, the strategic planning has identified early childhood education and high school completion as our priority areas of focus. We use data assessment, both self-assessment, partnership assessment. We have looked at best practices locally and nationally in those with respect to how to achieve outcomes of greater magnitude, if you will, and impact for those two priorities. We've engaged our partners, our leaders, our staff in the strategy development, and ultimately what we will come out with is greater buy-in from all of the partners, including leaders, but more importantly, the community authority to actually advocate for policy change. This approach that we are taking is really going to get us a lot closer to systems transformation by virtue of how we include policy and flip the decision-making authority, if you will, in terms of what needs to be resourced in order to achieve. So we are excited about that process. We are in phase 2 of it. We expect to complete what are the strategies and tactics work by February, and then we will operationalize that plan in Q1 of 2020. So it's really I think a model for other partners in our network, in our StriveTogether network, to it's fine to step back and say, you know what, let's realign and go deeper in order to set a model where the community and the civic infrastructure actually owns its part of the success for our kids. The only thing I would add in this shared vision piece is, and it's probably awkwardly to insert it here, but I think it's really important that our audience on this webinar know that StriveTogether's board of directors, and I chair the board, sees it very important for defining how the board works and shares the vision and actually operates to support the work and the priorities and our goals for 2023 as needing to include that partner voice in the leadership of the board. So our board currently has 2 partner leaders, myself and Russell Booker, who is superintendent of District 7 in Spartanburg, South Carolina. That is intentional because as we think about the 13.7 million kid movement and our commitment to systems transformation, we need to remain connected to the work on the ground. So that's what I would offer in terms of excitement from a partner perspective.
Great, thanks, Danae. So you're going to hear from Danae again in just a minute, but if you can go to the next slide, I want to highlight what's probably the most important thing that has come out of our evaluation, and that's helping us understand just how central equity needs to be, not just in outcomes. So if you were to look at an old version of the theory of action, you would see a principle around eliminating locally defined disparities. So when this work started many years ago, the goal was really to think about how to eliminate opportunity gaps for kids and families who are disenfranchised by so many systems. What we found through this evaluation, though, was that the work had to be about advancing equity in both outcomes and process. So we had to think about how do policies impact racial equity. Danae just mentioned our board of directors. In June of this year, our board of directors actually looked at some of the programmatic strategies that network members are doing as a way to eliminate gaps, but then also looked at what are the systemic barriers that are going to hinder those practices from actually getting to real equity. And so we're thinking about equity at the systems level, focusing on how community voice plays a role, how policy plays a role, and really thinking about the way that people take up collective impact. One thing we're thinking about is leadership and talent. So we talk about backbones and backbone staffs, and StriveTogether is committed in 2020 to working with network members to be able to think about how to not just create more diverse pools of talent, but how to infuse equity into recruitment, retention, hiring practices, all of those different things. So this has been a really sobering moment to recognize that there was still a lot more we needed to do, and now we're able to get to some of that. And if you could go to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly show something that many of you are probably familiar with, and that's the systems iceberg. And so one of our findings from the evaluation was that it's easy for communities to do work at what we call the events level, or some of those programmatic things like pizza parties for attendance that may have a short-term or inconsistent improvement in something, but that our work really has to be about shifting patterns of behavior, shifting the structures of systems to be more equitable, and changing mental models that inhibit the success of kids and families. And so I actually wanted to turn it to Danae to talk a little bit about how they're both infusing systems level work with a race equity lens.
Absolutely, and I want to say for our audience that the systems iceberg is like one of my favorite tools, largely because, again, after 8 years, we see how important the shift in mental models is to really addressing structural systems that impede or could be, if responsive to our Black and brown babies and youth, could be the critical pieces to success. So 2 examples of what I'm talking about. And we are using, in our 2 priorities that I mentioned before, early childhood education and high school completion, we will be setting targets that are specifically around Black males and Black and brown babies for the reasons that we've discovered through data will deliver the most impactful change, if you will. And so our 2 examples that I'll share with you is the work we've done around Black male opportunity youth, which are youth between the ages of 16 and 24 who are neither in school nor working. And we've done a lot of modeling of how do we get at the best recipe, for lack of a better word, for success and re-engagement of these youth. And the results haven't been there. And then at some point in our work with these youth, it dawned on us that we really need to have them tell us what are the barriers and what is needed in order to really deliver on the impact that we want to have, which is significant improvement and re-engagement of these youth in our community. That then led us to realize that we really need to not only have them shift the power and the authority, if you will, to these youth, but then to back it up with the resources to support what they said were the keys: peer-to-peer mentoring being one example, and safe and affordable housing being another. And so because of that, we've been able to engage our partners who are actually doing the youth work in how can they shift that power and not just have young Black and brown men at the table. And so we're looking forward to further work in that development. My last example is a program that was started by the Literacy Lab out of DC and that we've adapted and adopted in Milwaukee called Leading Men Fellows. Now, these young men are black and brown. They are recent high school graduates, none of whom were interested in entering the teaching profession, all of whom, once accepted, and the cohort is between 8 and 10 youth, have been, through training, been added to the teaching personnel, if you will, within our early childhood setting. So our babies 3, 4, and 5, these young men are a part of the reading initiative to get our young babies to establish a joy of learning, be able to write their names, identify their colors. And so through the techniques that they have used, we've seen phenomenal success in a 2-gen strategy way, if you will. Number one, our babies are excited and actually use the word "I love you" when they talk about these young men. Number two, that then impacts these young men to want to be a part of the positive impact on these babies. And high percentages of them then go on and choose to go into teaching. So among our initial 8, I believe half of them are enrolled in higher education to become teachers or paras in the classroom. And that has been consistent with the experience that the Literacy Lab has in the other 4 communities where they have implemented Leading Men Fellows. So when I talk about the impact of shifting a model, when you think about the impact that Leading Men Fellows has had both locally and nationally, we're also shifting the narrative around how people think about the value that young black men have to our community and what is going to be needed in order to, let's say, scale that up, because it's a tremendously impactful model.
Awesome. Danae, thank you. That is just one of my favorite examples. And for folks who were able to see some of the materials that I think went out via email yesterday, we actually have a video of the Leading Men Fellows, and it's pretty amazing to see the way that young people respond, but the way that these young black and brown men also see themselves having a career they never expected, working at a living wage job, enabling them to succeed while also making the difference in young people and really reframing the way people think about excellence. And so I'm not biased at all, but love that example. So if you move on to the next slide, for 30 seconds, I'm just going to really quickly talk about, okay, great, all of this is what it is, but so what for the field? And so on the next slide, we have just a couple of notes for the field. The first being that collective impact, when done with quality and rigor, actually has real impact. And so being able to tie process to outcome does yield results. We do know that civic infrastructure should be built in sequence. So while there is a lot of local context that's taken into account, there are a general set of mile markers and benchmarks to actually get to improved outcomes, and that we know that transforming systems takes time, and that requires patient capital. And so to investors or other folks who are in the practice of investing in collective impact, we hope that this is a way of being able to note that short-term wins with contributing indicators and infrastructure changes are possible. Those are still wins, and they're on the journey to even bigger transformation to get to those better and more equitable outcomes. And so we've been thrilled to talk about all of this, learn about all of this on a 6-year journey together. But now we're really excited for your questions. So Jen, I think you'll field those for us.
Yeah, great. So thanks for those who have been providing questions, and you can certainly continue to do so. So one clarifying question on the evaluation findings that I think would be helpful for folks. So if we could go back to slide 14, I think folks are interested in just a little bit more of a voiceover of the findings on that slide. The specific question was, what is the x-axis? But just talk a little bit more about it in general. And I think, yes, this one as well as perhaps the following, the one with the 3 years by Gateway. Yeah, that one.
Sure, Jen, I'll try to tackle that. So there are ways of working associated with each of these 4 pillars across each of these 4 gateways that are outlined in the theory of action. So they're very specific, and we operationalize those. And then we measured the extent that folks within communities have told us they're seeing evidence of those ways of working. So, for example, there are, if you look to the left, within the exploring gateway and the shared vision pillar, let's say there are 5 questions that communicate what shared vision at that gateway looks like, and 20 people were asked that question. That's a possible 100, so that's 100 sort of people questions, if you will. And since that rating is 60, let's just say 60 people of those, 60 out of 100 of those responses reported that they saw evidence of those behaviors across the board. So we tried to quantify these behaviors. So 60 out of 100 say saw evidence of shared vision. With evidence-based decision-making, about 70 saw evidence, or 70% saw evidence. So the ends, the denominators on all of these change, which is why it's a little hard to do on the fly. But these are the percentage of people who were asked whether they saw evidence of these things happening in their communities. And then we've charted that. And so we created a chart like this for every individual community as well. These reflect about 4,000 surveys over the 3-year period.
Great. I know Bridget mentioned a few times that you all can share the theory of action with more detail. We've had several requests for that. People are also curious if the survey questionnaires are proprietary, or those or some form of those are available for folks to see.
That is a great question. So they are proprietary, but here's why we actually wouldn't share them anyways. And we didn't talk a lot about this. They were built around the theory of action that we had in 2013. We've since revised it based on what we know. We've actually added another gateway. It's the Systems Transformation Gateway. So if you're looking at the theory of action, it is the gateway on the far right. So the questions aren't necessarily 100% aligned to the current benchmarks, and so we just wouldn't distribute that now because it'd be a little bit confusing with our current version of the theory of action.
Could you talk a little bit more about maybe pick one of the behaviors and describe a little bit about how it evolves through the gateways, for example, evidence of collective action?
Justin, do you want to talk through that quickly, and then maybe Danae and I could add some color to it?
Yeah, Bridget, I think you might actually be a better person to talk about that. So if you want to talk perhaps just very briefly about the sequencing of collaborative action, or maybe of data use, and how there are foundational pieces, and then over time the work gets more sophisticated. You might be able to speak to that better than me.
Yeah, I think we could talk policy would be a great example. So policy work didn't actually show up in our original theory of action until our sustaining gateway. And one of the things we learned through the evaluation, like we saw low scores and then higher scores related to practice change. And one of the things that told us is that communities were starting, as they got more advanced, to tackle policy change. But what we learned from the qualitative side of the house was that we needed to be more explicit about policy work earlier on in the theory of action. So if you look, it's in the investment and sustainability pillar. If you look at that pillar now across gateways, you'll see policy work show up more. And so our hypothesis is that in the previous version of the theory of action, it took communities longer to actually get to a place where they were comfortable doing some kind of local or state policy work. Now we've learned that there's a certain type of framing and some groundwork that can be done that enables that work. I'm not sure if that's the exact answer to the question, but that's definitely one we were really excited about.
And if I could just really quickly weigh in, again, using that same policy example, what we know in the field is that so much of how we impact parents and families, for example, is the need to get policy change in both in terms of legislative and institutional in order to eliminate barriers or to have systems work better towards a certain outcome. And so now StriveTogether as a national network has resourced building policy advocacy and mobilization capacity at local levels in recognition of the importance to impact and outcomes that policy represents. So I would offer that.
Great. Another question for Danae. In Milwaukee, have you been able to effectively communicate about these evaluation findings to your community partners and stakeholders? I work at a backbone, and it takes a little while to wrap my head around these findings. I wonder how to make these accessible to partners.
So, very good question, and I have to tell you that we are relying on the communication toolkit that StriveTogether is presenting for us because, quite frankly, it is very hard to, we have this challenge with jargon in the first place, and I think that we're trying to get a wider understanding of the importance of the infrastructure assessment. So I have to say, Jen, it's a work in progress, that we're not exactly where we need to be, but the partners who probably were responsive to the survey, especially over the last 3 years, have a better appreciation. But I can't say that we've actually got some secret sauce on how to effectively communicate the power of this evaluation and assessment yet.
I can actually say one of the things we've done, we worked with a couple of network members to develop an evaluation messaging toolkit, both for partnerships who are part of the evaluation or even those who weren't, who are able to communicate about the theory of action. And so I know in Adams County, Colorado, and Minneapolis, St. Paul, and in many other communities, they've been using that as a way to say, like, here's some validation behind this framework that we've been talking about for years. And so some of them are really starting to think about how does it provide that kind of credibility to be affiliated with something that's actually starting to show improvement in outcomes.
Great, thanks both. So a question, finding patient capital and patient investors is difficult. What have you found resonates with the funders and donors to get the initial investment in collective impact and systems change and then to maintain their investment?
So I would actually throw that to Danae first locally and also maybe wearing her StriveTogether board hat. Danae, are you comfortable taking that question?
Oh, sure. I would say that locally, we were, my example would be, we have 4 major funders who each invested quite a bit of resources over a 4-year period. And what drew them to say yes to that, not only because of the president of our community foundation who created this or brought this model here, but it was this notion that it is the partnership that has to work together in a community where that is not how we've operated. We are very much like many other communities, siloed in our behavior. And so the notion that we could use data, share a vision, create outcomes that we all commit to was quite attractive to the funding community. We have since formed a funders collaborative model, which then continues the other sweet sauce, if you will, which is the learning along the way of what the power of collective impact is in helping to determine what resources deliver the most impact. So I think that's one. Number 2, I think that when you look for now with my board hat on and board chair hat on, I think that what is resonating with investors is this notion of how resources can be leveraged to reach or have outcomes affecting 13.7 million children in our country. And everybody's looking for impact. And when you can use data to show the impact, as this assessment does, I think that's been one of the number one. The other challenge, oh boy. Sorry, everybody, I went off, but I hope you can still hear me.
Okay. We can hear you. Yep.
Okay. I'm sorry. I just asked for a battery. It hasn't gotten here yet, so apologize for that. But what I would say is the opportunity to leverage local and state and national resources to influence government allocation of resources is quite attractive to an ever-growing number of investors and funders.
Great, thank you. I will open it to whoever is interested in this question. Has the change in or turnover in community stakeholder representatives over time affected community engagement, partner engagement, or outcomes? I don't know if that's something that was specifically looked at in the study, but it's certainly something we know a lot of collective impact partnerships struggle through.
Yeah, so I'll tackle this first from the national perspective. And what I'll preface this with is that I haven't seen an impact in outcomes directly, but what I will say is that we are experiencing a lot of transition in the backbones. So just in the last 18 months, I'd say at least 12 of the partnership founders have gone on to other roles, retired, or gone on to something else. And one of the things that we're hearing, especially from white leaders, is that they see a real opportunity to be able to step back and allow someone from the community to lead. And in some cases, that is a person of color, or in some cases, that's a community member that has been identified as a true leader in the community. I think about Graduate Tacoma as a prime example of that. Their new executive director is a woman of color who lives in Tacoma, is a product of Tacoma Public Schools. And so she's able to get traction with community members and partners in a way that's very different than someone who may be outside of the community or may not be the most well-equipped to be able to do that work. And so I would say we're seeing staff transition, but we're also seeing a lot of really powerful structural shifts from that. So while I anticipate that those backbone shifts will create a little turbulence, I actually see that they're better positioning communities to be able to do real equity work. Now, in terms of partners, I mean, I know that in Multnomah County, Oregon, where Portland sits, they've had in their over a dozen school districts 10, 15 superintendent changes in the last few years. And so those are much more harder to navigate, right? Because when people with power come in, they have an agenda. It may be different than the past agenda. And so we're actually doing some more work as a network this year to really think about those types of transitions and how to build some of that institutional policy that isn't as malleable based on transitions in people.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and field for any of you. How do you measure the shifts in mental models? For example, you talked about how young Black men can impact the community and the shift in that mental model in Milwaukee. But this is more of an evaluation question. How do you actually think about measuring mental models? So if someone wants to either point to resources or share a little bit about that in the last few minutes, and then we can wrap up.
Well, I can't say that we have actually measured change in mental model. We can talk anecdotally about what we've seen and how the shift in wanting a different narrative around Black males is definitely growing, if you will, among our partners. But honestly, that's going to be work to come in the next strategic plan over the next 3 years, because we do want to measure that. So.
And Justin, did you want to add anything? I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. Yes, I'll just add briefly that is a challenge, and one of the nice things, right, about the pyramid is that ultimately, if mental models are going to change, they're going to manifest themselves in observable behavior. So for the purposes of this evaluation, we did not measure changes in mental models, but we measured changes in the things that we would expect to change if mental models are changing. It doesn't necessarily mean they are, but we very much focused on, and we described it on the one slide as what we would expect to see happening. We really tried to make our survey for this evaluation very behaviorally oriented and try to capture ways of working that are very visible. So that does not capture how mental models would be tracked, but ultimately we changed mental models so that partners and players and organizations work differently, and so that policies and practices change. So we did focus for this evaluation on those observable behaviors, but it's a really good question.
Great. Well, Justin, Danae, and Bridget, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the StriveTogether Network and Equal Measure for all of the learning that you're sharing out with the field of practice. And, you know, I'm particularly excited and glad to see some of the data that shows that really investing in building civic infrastructure within our broader collective impact forum network, we really talk about sort of the collaborative infrastructure that supports these kinds of cross-sector partnerships, you know, that it really, in many cases, is contributing to the outcomes that these collaboratives are looking to achieve. And so the study and the research is super useful, and thank you again. Let's just go one more slide here. For those that are interested in continuing to learn with the Collective Impact Forum, please do consider joining us in May in Minneapolis in the Twin Cities. We have a terrific agenda lined up with great speakers and sessions lifting up a broad range of work, including some of the local StriveTogether work across Minnesota for those interested in learning more. So thank you so much, and we wish everyone a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.